So, and it looks like you have nice weather in New York, just like we do. A little chilly, but very nice.
I'm in DC, but it's very nice.
Oh, you're in DC, even better. Okay, so
Yeah.
you're based here?
I live here. I'm in New York sort of 3 days a week
Okay.
on average. Each week's a little different.
Let me just pull this up here. This make sure we're on, because here, let's go here. Okay, we are live. So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining another Sinocism live chat. Today, we have a great guest. We have Ambassador Mike Froman, who is the current president of the Council on Foreign Relations. Previously, a long career in business as well as in the Obama administration. He was a deputy national security advisor for international trade and economics, as well as over at the National Economic Council, and then he was the head of the U.S. Trade Representative for several years. So the topic of today is very timely. We actually arranged this call before the latest escalation, but we want to talk about the U.S.-China trade war. So Ambassador Froman, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
And the other thing I will say is that Ambassador Froman is now on Substack, and we will put a link into the show notes so everyone can go follow him and subscribe to his Substack, as well as I think more content that will be coming out from the Council on Foreign Relations. So it's a great addition to the Substack community. So thank you for that. So if you could first just maybe tell the audience a little bit more about your background and sort of give a little more detail about what you've done and sort of what your experiences with China in particular.
Well, I started really in U.S.-Soviet relations and a focus on arms control, and then the end of the Cold War came about, and had been interested in negotiations and ended up doing trade. Actually, first in the Clinton administration at the White House, and then I was over at the Treasury Department working on Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union, Middle East, and then became chief of staff there, and then went into the private sector. And so I've been back and forth between the government and the private sector, really focused on those issues where the private sector and the public sector come together around either trade or infrastructure or financial inclusion, development, things of that sort.
Great. So where are we with the U.S. and China? What's your read on, the overall relationship under President Trump, but especially what's been happening over the last week?
Well, needless to say, we're at a moment of great uncertainty. We think there may be a meeting between President Xi and President Trump on the margins of APEC in Korea, but actually neither side has been able to fully confirm that as of this morning. And so, yeah, even that meeting, which was not really intended to resolve major issues, but really just get the relationship back on track, seems to be somewhat in question. Look, I think the Trump administration came in, and we saw some of this in the first Trump administration, but certainly more in this administration, determined to redefine the relationship with China. There are a lot of China hawks in the administration. Sometimes it's a little unclear where the president himself is on the issue, because sometimes he's quite hawkish, and in other cases he seems quite eager to use his personal diplomacy to reach a deal with President Xi, some big grand bargain. Right. And that's why having a meeting is so important at this stage, to see what direction the president wants to take the relationship going forward.
And what's interesting is, normally if there were going to be a leader to leader meeting, right, you would see, say, the U.S. Secretary of State meet with his counterpart Wang Yi, sort of set the prep work tone for the staff level work. That hasn't happened. We are 2 weeks out from a meeting. It's 15 days. The Chinese have a big meeting next week, the fourth plenum, so they're going to be busy. I'm hearing also that at least as of last night, the trade lead on the Chinese side, Ho Lifeng, isn't picking up the phone, so to speak. He's not willing to arrange a call with Secretary Besson and Ambassador Greer. And so it seems like we're both sides are cutting it pretty short to have a meeting, because the Chinese side, as you've been in these meetings, they don't want to go into these meetings with the big guy with a lot of uncertainty, right?
That's right. I mean, they don't tend to go for spontaneity. I mean, really, everything tends to be well scripted before the meeting. They want to manage any downside risk of a meeting that might embarrass
right.
their leader. And to your point, traditionally, well, when you say traditionally, in the Biden administration, there was a very strong channel between the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan,
Hmm.
and his counterpart, also with Secretary Blinken. The same was true in the Obama administration, very strong dialogues there. To the degree there's been preparation, I understand it's been mostly by the economic team, Secretary of Treasury, the USTR, Secretary of Commerce, and to your point, that deals with one set of issues. But for example, it doesn't really address issues around necessarily Taiwan or South China Sea or North Korea, nonproliferation, support for Russia during in the Ukraine war, et cetera. So it's unclear what the agenda of this meeting is going to be beyond a couple of trade issues, and even there, unclear about what they would expect to see coming out of this as a set of deliverables.
Right. And so you've written several good pieces recently. There's one, I think, in the current issue of Foreign Affairs on, I think the title is After the Trade War, because your point is the global trade system, the rules-based system. There you go. You're on the
There you
cover. There
go.
you go.
Shameless self promotion of our magazine.
Um, and then I think you had one a few days ago. I guess it was the sort of last week, so last Friday, where you talked about how this current rare earths regime was just quite an escalation. Um, Two questions, kind of bigger, both related. First, on the rare earths bit, and it's a question from one of our Sinocism readers. Is, as you said in that recent piece, the Chinese action was a massive economic escalation, which shows that deterrence failed, and China believes it has escalation dominance. How does the U.S. convince China that that's not the case?
Like, I think it's quite tricky because on one hand, China is responding to what they view as U.S. escalatory economic policy, i.e., the tariffs. I mean, at one point, the tariffs were up to 145%.
Mm-hmm.
China demonstrated in the spring that it had a degree of leverage and cut off some magnets. It quickly de-escalated. Now they've launched a series of additional export controls. And it's interesting timing to do it 2.5, 3 weeks before a potential summit meeting. I kind of wonder whether the right hand knew what the left hand was doing here, because China has had, in my view, kind of a remarkable lack of sophistication when it comes to exercising soft power. If you think about the Belt and Road Initiative, Bill, I think they could have really run the tables on us around the world as we were pulling back, and they were moving forward. But this Belt and Road Initiative, in some respects, became a negative in a lot of countries, sort of this loan to own kind of model. And similarly, over the last 8 months, they have been positioning themselves as the defenders of the global trading system, as the
Mm-hmm.
defenders of multilateralism, and painting the U.S. and the Trump administration as the disruptor. Well, the Trump administration certainly has been a disruptor, but now I think China has put itself sort of on the same level as the United States in the eyes not only of the U.S. but of the rest of the world in terms of threatening open trade, in terms of its use of export controls here. So I think they've done a disservice to themselves if putting ourselves in their shoes. If you're trying to exercise influence and global leadership and distinguish yourself from the United States, it doesn't help to look, as unilateral and using economic coercion in the same way that the U.S. is currently looked at as in doing so.
Well, and to that point, they've also been, and from Xi Jinping on down, they've been very adamant about how they are the protector of global supply chains, and they keep making the point about, avoiding the breaking supply chains, and yet here they are threatening global industrial supply chains. And so one of the things today, and I think they're very sensitive to this, as you said, is today, this morning, or Thursday, Beijing time, the Ministry of Commerce came out with a press conference, and they were very defensive. They explained that this was a reaction to, I think they said, 20 different actions by the U.S. since Madrid, including but not only the expansion of the BIS entity list to include the 50% threshold. But this morning they said that the U.S. interpretation seriously distorts and exaggerates China's measures, deliberately fueling unnecessary misunderstanding and panic. And so from my perspective, that says they understand what you're saying, that actually they're hearing from lots of other countries that this is not just a U.S.-China bilateral thing, that this is actually causing a whole bunch of problems and concerns in other capitals. You think that's a fair interpretation?
Well, I think they're right that it's causing concern in other capitals and will help drive other countries closer to the United States in terms of responding to this. I, I don't think they're right in criticizing the U.S. for unnecessarily or purposely stirring the pot here. I think the actions they announced, whether they intended them or not, are pretty draconian, including putting so many products under the potential for export controls, adopting a rule that they always hated the U.S. implementing, the foreign
Right.
direct product rule, so that any small amount of Chinese product, even in a of Chinese input into a product made somewhere else, is now subject to controls, including the technology and the know-how that goes into it. That's a big step um, for them as well, to expand it to include that. And the fact that they announced, well, it's not a ban, it's only a regulatory regime. Well, that's not really, that's kind of cold comfort, because we know that they have the ability to turn on and off. It goes back to 2010 when they first did it vis-a-vis Japan. They have the ability to turn on and off access to these choke point technologies as they see fit for political purposes. And so I think it's right for the U.S. to react negatively to this announcement. I think it's right for other countries to be concerned about it as well.
And to that point about other countries, do you like if you were in government now, how would you organize some sort of a collective response, and what would that look like? Because it does seem like this is again not something that the U.S. can deal with alone.
I think the U.S. would be more effective if it deals with allies and partners on this. I think there's an opportunity there, and in that most recent piece in Foreign Affairs magazine, I talk about open plurilateralism and countries, coalitions of the willing, coalitions of the ambitious, coming together around various issues, including around export controls, and having a common view on how to address export controls. I saw that the Secretary of the Treasury said something about trying to pull together countries together in ideas behind trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was that you'd have a group of countries working together, creating habits of cooperation, so that when they needed to respond to a Chinese action, they had the mechanisms and the institutions and the capabilities to do so. So I think that is the right approach: is to seek out allies who are going to be as concerned as we are about what this new regime might mean, and to try and come up with a collective response that hopefully China will respond to.
And I guess the question really is it, I think some of those relationships are a bit more frayed now than they were a few months ago, and just given the way some of them have been treated. But I'm still hopeful that this is almost an existential issue for some of these bigger economies, that they'll sort of look past what they consider to be problems, right, and be able to still work with the U.S. at least on this issue, because it does seem like it. I mean, it's incredibly dangerous and challenging for any advanced industrial economy, right?
Look, I think that's right, and I think this administration has obviously invested less in the allies and partners and keeping relationships good. It's been more bilateral in its approach, by using tariffs to get them to come to the table to agree to concessions. There's a lot of tension between these various countries, but here's an area again. I think over time, national interests trump, so to speak, and these other countries have similar national interests that the United States has, and so hopefully whatever lack of trust or animosity they're feeling about the trade tensions between them and the United States, they can see that this is an area that we need to act collectively on. I think the challenge, Bill, is that these are long-term projects. You
Right.
don't change your dependence on critical minerals in China overnight. It takes years, maybe decades. We were talking about Japan. I think Japan, after that experience in 2010, reduced its dependency on China from something like 85% to 60%. So good progress, but it is still 60% dependent on China. And the first step is to recognize that we need our allies and partners, that we're not going to be able to produce all of this in the United States. We are investing in that, and I think the administration has been quite innovative in using various tools, Defense Production Act and others, to begin to invest and support production in the United States of critical minerals. But it's going to take a very long time to become, significantly independent of China when it comes to that supply. And we need a strategy with allies and partners to achieve that.
And one of the other questions, and you see it a lot, is just that this is clearly an issue that's been a known issue for at least 15 years now. When after I think it was a fishing boat collision between a Japanese and a vessel and a Chinese fishing boat that then led and the Chinese, of course, denied that they ever blocked exports of rare earths, but they did, and the Japanese knew it. Why has the policy responses in not just the U.S. but in other countries, why has it been so hard to actually mount an effective and sustained approach to addressing this issue? I remember, during the Biden administration, I mean, the Trump one obviously talked about this, and they were aware of this issue. Biden administration, I think there was like some sort of critical minerals dialogue or discussion with the Australians. There were lots of papers written, lots of, I think, as your colleague Russ Doshi called it, lots of admiration of the problem. But somehow there wasn't the ability to turn that awareness and concern into actual action. Is this now the Chinese have they forced people's hands, do you think?
I think they probably have, and we'll see how long the attention span is. But look, there are a lot of these issues around dependence on China for not just critical minerals, but for supply chains generally that people admired. They admired the problem for a long time, but it was so compelling from just an economic efficiency point of view to rely on China to be the manufacturing floor of the global economy that when it came to individual company decisions, it was much easier to say, well, we're going to put our next plant in China, or we're going to rely on China, than to say we're going to invest in the United States, or we're going to invest with an ally or partner because we're worried about overdependence. And here, I think people were overly complacent over the years. Efficiency of supply chains used to be the be all and end all, sort of the number one value, and efficiency is still important, but so is national security, so is diversification. The number one rule of risk management in anything, in investing in stocks, is diversification.
Right.
And yet companies, one after another, including, we're very dependent on China for inputs into our defense sector. So even when it comes to core national security areas, we have some dependencies on China because it was so efficient to source from there. And again, it's going to be more expensive. It's going to be more fragmented. But we need to have diversification so we're not so dependent, particularly in areas of national security. But more broadly, these critical minerals are not only relevant to magnets that go into the cones of missiles and go into advanced aircraft, but into the car seats in your car, into the electric motor that goes into the seats in your car. And so we need to have a strategy for thinking about how we're going to diversify our access to this. And maybe, as you suggested, this action by China will be what spurs on. The fact that this administration is now talking about working with allies and partners in much the same way that previous administrations have,
Right.
but this administration has tended to eschew, is hopefully a good first step to say, okay, we got to convene a group, work on it, come up with a solution. And even if it takes 10 years, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. We got to start now.
And I guess one of the concerns I think that I've heard, and I think it's fairly valid, is, if now this is sort of pushed, it's the tipping point, so to speak, and it pushes a much more concerted effort to reduce this Chinese reliance. What do the Chinese do in that sort of window where they still have this incredible leverage? And how do they use that? And does that potentially raise the risks of other contingencies, say around Taiwan or broader problems in the relationship?
Look, I think the Chinese have been very, up to now, have been quite smart in how they have used their economic leverage. They didn't overreact as the Trump administration imposed higher and higher tariffs, either across the board or on particular sectors. They imposed higher tariffs too, but always less than the U.S. did. When they wanted to when the tariffs got to 145%, they used a narrow application of export controls on magnets to get the attention of the administration,
Right.
and it was de-escalated. And I think they've spent much of the last few years really identifying where in their economy they have leverage, where the choke points are, and how to calibrate that, how to titrate the leverage that they have in response to various U.S. actions. I think this most recent action, both the nature of it and the timing, may represent a bit of an overreach. And um,
Did you hit something? You just went
I did.
sideways.
I didn't hit anything. I noticed that I'm sideways. Um,
Uh-oh. Let
happy
me we
to. I'm happy to roll over on my side if it's helpful. But
no. We don't want this. Let's see. Are you still how did this happen? Let me just see. I didn't do anything either. So sorry everybody.
oh no,
Nope.
I'm still sideways.
Let's see. That's not right. Okay, technical, the joys of technology. How do we do this here? So oh, God, this technology. Let me see here. Um
We've got a gentleman here who's going to also try and help. Well,
See what?
What's this? I've never seen this before.
oh, there
There
we
we
go.
go. There we
All
go.
right,
Sorry,
all right.
everybody. And
There.
those who will listen to this on on an audio feed, you will just know that Ambassador Froman went sideways for a little while. Literally,
Really?
not his physical
I've
sideways.
I've
Not
been accused of that for some time.
right.
So,
Sorry about that. So back to sorry to back
so
to
I
what
think
you were.
they've used, I think they have prepared to use their leverage, and they've used it fairly judiciously up to now. I wonder whether this most recent announcement is an example of overreach, particularly with regard to the timing and the summit meeting, or and also the extent to which the system represents a more fundamental threat to global supply chains.
Well, I think that's a great point because it does seem like one sort of hypothesis is that really this is just the Chinese saying, okay, we're done with this. We want to just stop this sort of tit for tat escalatory BS, and we just want to play our card, and let's just get to the meat of things and just get a deal. And so there versus there had been some reporting. The Wall Street Journal had the story yesterday. Citing I think it was people close to Beijing decision makers that she's betting that the president can't handle a stock market crash,
Mhm.
and so this again will force a U.S. retreat. I do think though, and you I think you've seen this in your own as a practitioner, right? It does seem like there are moments when the Chinese tend to overreach, right? And
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier about their use of soft power, and I'll borrow a phrase that was originally coined in the Middle East. I think the Chinese, never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, and I think here they have missed an opportunity to get the relationship, back on a much firmer track, and to send the message to the global community that yes, they're the responsible parties in the room, taking care of the global trading system, and they can be trusted. Trust is hard to build over
Mhm.
time and very easy to dissipate quickly through missteps, and I think this has been a misstep.
and so assuming that the presidents, Trump and Xi meet at the end of the month, and then the He Fong and his team, I assume Li Chenggang, the Wolf Warrior, as Secretary Besson called him, will still go. Assuming they have these meetings, if you were there, how would you walk this back? Like, what's an acceptable sort of solution or tentative or short term deal to this situation? Because it seems like if the Chinese just agree to, we won't implement this, and the U.S. says, okay, isn't the U.S. then effectively legitimizing this new export control regime and saying they acknowledge that the Chinese have done this and it's acceptable?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult because, particularly since so many elements of it reflect a mirror image of the U.S. export control system,
Right.
the foreign direct product rule, et cetera. And so I think the question will be, what is the broader deal that could be agreed to, where people would say, okay, this is tolerable in the context of a broader agreement. Were we heading towards another phase one deal like the first term, where it was more of a purchase and sale agreement of buying more soybeans or LNG from us? Were we heading towards a discussion of Taiwan? We know the Chinese would like the U.S. to change its rhetoric on
Right.
Taiwan, to move from saying we don't support Taiwanese independence to that we oppose Chinese independence, or excuse me, Taiwanese independence. Is that what what China's trying to get out of this negotiation? I think that these are the hard questions that there should be preparation on right now, and this new announcement I think has thrown a bit of a spanner in the works in terms of what can come out of this conversation. I think if they meet, probably the most that can come is an agreement on a process for our economic officials and maybe our national security officials to engage in a negotiation and to try and resolve it, because it seems very difficult to resolve between now and 2 weeks from now.
And I think that must be why it was either Treasury Secretary Bessent or Ambassador Greer, I think, who floated yesterday or the day before this idea that they could extend there's this deadline, I think, until November. They could extend that again, and just sort of just keep. And I think the Chinese are usually happy to keep talking, right?
No, I think that's right, and they'll certainly want to extend that. That was the suspension of the tariffs that went all the way up, I believe, to 145%.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's an easy thing to do, to extend that pause. Like in some respects, I think China's read the art of the deal and is taking a page out of Trump's negotiating strategy, which is to set out a very audacious, sometimes almost ridiculous point of view, compromise on 50% of that, which is still much higher than
Right.
anybody would have expected to begin with. So, I don't really believe in this taco trade theory about the president always chickening out.
I
I think
agree
it's
with you.
I think it's a negotiating strategy. And had you asked people a year ago, would we have 15% baseline tariffs on the rest of the world, or on most of the world, and up to 50%. Now we have 57% right now on Chinese imports. People have said, "Oh no, that's ridiculous. We're never going to increase our average applied tariff 5 times, 6 times from where it was, prior to the first Trump administration." But that's exactly where we are. And even though he had asked for even more, it started at an even higher level. To compromise where he did is still much higher than people would have expected. I think China is in some ways taking the same strategy, which is to set out now a very draconian export control system. The question is, to your point, how do they back down from this? And to what degree is export controls now becoming just another trade issue? The president opened this up with the whole issue around the H20 semiconductor chip. Traditionally, export controls were not something the U.S. was willing to negotiate over because they were about national security.
Right.
You went through an excruciating, detailed process of saying this technology is so critical to this specific national security needs that we cannot afford to let it fall into the hands of our competitor or our adversary.
Adversaries, right.
Yeah. And now it was like, well, we put it on the list, and then we've agreed to take it off the list, and we have a 15% revenue share on anything we sell to China. So the signal sent to China was that everything's for negotiation, including national security, including export controls. Question will be, how does China now apply that lesson to itself?
And I was in a chat yesterday. Someone was joking that Xi Jinping writes a lot of books, or there are a lot of books that are issued in Xi Jinping's name. The next one should be The Art of the Xi Jinping Deal. And, it seems like President Trump has been trolling Xi a little bit on Truth Social, so maybe there'll be some trolling back. Because certainly, as you pointed out, the Chinese have learned a lot, I think, from the U.S., especially in terms of export controls. And their view, you listen to Chinese official statements and private statements, and they're saying we just are doing what you did around semiconductor equipment.
Exactly.
And look, it's hard to say no to that. It's hard to say that's not fair. We get to do it and you don't, right?
Well, I think where it's not hard is to say, look, these critical minerals are not just for military use. They are truly dual use. Right. And there are lots of purely benign uses of critical minerals, and China should not cut off the rest of the world, or should not threaten to cut off the rest of the world through regulation, through having to approve specific licenses
and getting like all the schematics of your products and your
that's the other piece
supply
of it.
chain,
Yeah.
right?
I'm glad you raised that. That's another part of this regulation, which again, goes much further than anything we've seen before. That they want to see all of the schematics of any product that their critical minerals are going to go into, and therefore it's a great way to vacuum up intellectual property from around the world. So I think it really is an overreach. Those are the sort of things perhaps they could step back from. That's the sort of thing they could say, we don't need to see the schematics, or we're only going to regulate this to military end users. That's something that's more in line with how the U.S. has applied export controls in a true national security sense than to say everyone's going to need a license for any purpose, whether it's for the nose cone of a missile or for a car seat.
Right, or even using our equipment. I mean, that you've already purchased years ago without these rules. I mean, again, it's so it seemed like it's one of those things where I think this. I mean, I know that, and I don't know if it's a tactic from the Trump administration or they really believe this. They seem to be trying to message that, maybe Xi Jinping didn't know about this, right? That maybe there was someone went rogue. I'm skeptical of that argument. I think this is I do think that, as you said, they make this very expansive and aggressive ask, and even if they give up 50%, they still created a new reality that's much more favorable to China, right?
I think that's right, and also this is an important issue. Absolutely, critical minerals, export controls on critical minerals, absolutely important. But we're also not talking about other issues in the U.S.-China relationship as a result. And sometimes we end up finding ourselves talking about not necessarily marginal issues, but we're not talking about the fact that China is pursuing an economic strategy that is still reliant on export-led growth and subsidizing industries, creating excess capacity at the expense of industrial production around the rest of the world. Those fundamental questions about how do we reconcile China's economic strategy with an open trading system, those are not currently on the table. Nor are we talking about Taiwan or the South China Sea or North Korea,
Right.
nonproliferation, Ukraine, et cetera, which are critical issues in the U.S.-China relationship. Now all the focus is on this one, albeit important, but one narrow issue compared to the rest of the relationship. And to me, that's the biggest issue, which is if we really want to put the U.S.-China relationship on a fundamentally different footing, we can't continue to ignore the underlying drivers of the tension between us and have to have a way of having a conversation with China about that. And we have not seen that as of yet.
So, remaking rules from the ruins of the rule-based system. Back to your essay. What does, if we remake this, if it gets remade, what does it look like? Because isn't China, so much of what Xi Jinping says and the people around him, repeatedly talk about it is how they're the upholder of the multilateral trading system. They're the good guys. They're protected at the WTO. Is the remaking of the global trading system just a WTO that's more dominated by China, or does WTO need to fundamentally change, or is it actually almost obsolete at this point?
So I think
Simple question.
yeah, exactly. I'm not sure I'd use the word obsolete, but I did start off the essay by saying the global trading system as we know it is dead. And I think that's true. And that includes the role that we anticipated for the WTO when it was created in the 1990s. Look, I think you've got China's been following its own set of rules, its own economic strategy for the better part of 3 decades. Now the U.S. is following its own set of rules without regard to what the WTO says or what our obligations are under various other trade agreements. So you have the two largest economies of the world following their own rules. What does that mean for the rest of the world? What does it mean for the rules-based system itself? It's very possible the EU, Japan, Canada, the middle countries, the global South, maybe they will continue to say it's all about the WTO and we're just going to continue to follow the WTO rules. It's also possible that other countries go their own way. We've already seen in Europe, as ideologically committed they are to the WTO and the multilateral rules-based trading system, they've already begun to impose non most favored nation tariffs
Mhm.
on China in response to what's been going on. So I think they're slower to it than the U.S. They probably won't go as far as the U.S., but I think it's already beginning to fray there because they are very concerned about all that excess capacity. If it's kept out of the U.S. market because of our protectionism, it's
Right.
got to end up somewhere. And is it going to be Europe? Is it going to be the major emerging economies? India is scared stiff of Chinese dumping and undermining its manufacturing sector, which is still very much in the process of developing. So I think the question is, where does it go from here? And I argue that it's really more likely to head towards these coalitions of the willing coming together around various issues. For some, like the CPTPP countries, it could be to open economies and to liberalize. And the
Mhm.
UK joining CPTPP, I think, is a good example of that. For others, including the US and what Secretary Besson recently said, maybe it's bringing countries together to say we need a response on export controls, on critical minerals. It'll be a little bit less about opening economies and liberalizing and lowering tariffs than it is about how to pursue industrial policies together, how to achieve scale in some of these critical areas, how to diversify our supply chains and have more safe and trusted supply chains outside of China, being overly dependent on China. So I think that's the direction it's likely to go in. And I think that's preferred to having anarchy. I think you want rules, even if they don't apply to everybody, and there are subsets of countries that have rules around subsets of issues. That's a better situation for the global economy than having no rules at all. We saw what no rules at all looks like, prior to the Second World War, when trade was really a tool, it was really a weapon, and that can spill over into kinetic conflict as well.
Right. I think that's and so what you're saying is have almost these ad hoc sort of relationships or coalitions over maybe some specific issues. But so is the WTO still relevant? What would their role be?
Look, it's it's hard to say, right? They have three functions right now. They were designed to have three functions. Be the forum for major multilateral trade negotiations. That hasn't happened for a while. I think the last one
Right.
happened when I was USTR. We had the Trade Facilitation Agreement. Um, Second, to monitor countries' trade policies. And if countries like China aren't participating, aren't submitting their trade policies for review, that's weakened. And thirdly, to be a forum for binding dispute settlement. And for a whole range of reasons, the U.S. As well as others have had concerns about the dispute settlement system. So that's sort of ground to a halt. Countries have come together under the WTO. There's a fisheries agreement. There's sort of an ad hoc dispute settlement system that's growing up among coalitions of countries that are willing to submit to it. So it's still potentially an umbrella for countries that want to cooperate there. And still, something like 70% of global trade is happening under the MFN rules of the WTO of the WTO agreement. So it is not completely obsolete, but I wouldn't necessarily look to the WTO for being able to drive the next set of rules development for the global economy.
It certainly, I mean, as a non-trade expert, it certainly looks like they don't have that ability anymore. So one question related to that, China recently
And
announced,
just by the way, Bill, it's
yeah,
not their fault. I mean,
no, 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 no,
it's
I
not
don't
the
want
fault
to.
of Ngozi. It's not the fault
Right,
of the staff. The international organizations like the WTO are only as strong as the consensus of the member states.
right,
And
and
if the
that's been breaking
U.S.,
down for
China,
years.
exactly, if the U.S., China, and the other major economies don't see eye to eye as to how the global economy should be structured, what the rules should be, what it means to comply with those rules, then the WTO is sort of left without the necessary foundation of support to do its job.
I agree. Then thank you for clarifying that. So one question on the WTO and China specifically. Recently, we had the announcement that I think it was Premier Lee at the UN General Assembly announced that China will no longer seek developing country status at the WTO for, I think it was for new things, not for anything existing. What is that? If you can explain to the audience, what does that mean? And how
So
meaningful actually is it?
yeah, I thought it was a very clever announcement. Again, part of their strategy of saying they're the defenders of the multilateral
Right. They're the
system.
responsible
They're
country.
the
They're the,
responsible party. This has been a long-standing issue, that
Right.
the U.S. and other advanced industrialized countries have complained about, which is that, China, clearly a globally competitive industrialized economy, would claim that it's still a developing country, and under the rules of the WTO, less is expected out of the developing countries than is expected out of the industrialized countries. And the Doha round, which was the last effort to negotiate a big multilateral round, that was very much built into that because that was considered the development round, and it sort of locked in China as a developing country. So on one hand, this is them saying we're responsible. We recognize that that since the Doha round was launched in 2001, we're a fundamentally different economy than we were back then, and we can afford to take on greater responsibilities. On the other hand, it's a totally valueless statement because it suggests there's going to be some big multilateral agreement where this issue will be on the table. And since we're not negotiating any big multilateral agreements, and that function of the WTO has ground to a halt, it's a pretty free concession to give away.
Right. I mean, it's something they can pocket with, big sort of propaganda, public relations win with zero cost, it seems like. And
Exactly.
again, as you look at, you talked about BRI, I mean, if you look at where they're positioning themselves globally, it's also about, they still say they're the leader of the developing countries. They're the leader of the global South. It's all about supporting the rights of the global South countries against, big bad US and other, the U.S. wet-led West, I think, and so this just seems like it fits in with that broader approach.
That's absolutely.
Um, Interesting. So, and it seems like maybe that's why they're a little concerned about the way the U.S. has pushed back on the export control regime around rare earths, because it does seem like they've gotten sensitive to the idea that somehow they're breaking supply chains globally.
I think that's right. Look, I think if you take two actions like the active support of Russia's effort in Ukraine, and then this announcement of export controls, I think both of those have the effect of driving the U.S. and its traditional allies and partners closer together. And even though the Trump administration has taken a number of actions that, have had that have driven some of our allies and partners away, or created distrust in that relationship, or concerns in that relationship, China's actions, I think, are helping to bring those alliances and partnerships back together.
So Xi Jinping might not be the strategic genius that some people think he is, but I mean, I have to say, I think, the Chinese, I do think the Chinese side has played their cards pretty well. And to your earlier comments about, we need, focus more on things like national security, not so much on, just in time supply chain. I mean, this is the Chinese under Xi Jinping have been doing this for over a decade. I mean, in some
That's right.
ways, he's the first Trump one certainly focused minds, but I think they were already talking about this. And you look at how Xi Jinping, they define this comprehensive national security concept, and supply chains and breaking the U.S. technological chokeholds. I mean, they seem like they're actually ahead of us on this.
Well, absolutely. I mean, like, they laid out, I think, as early as 2013 publicly what the strategy was, and the China 2025 strategy, saying here are some critical technologies that we intend to be dominant in. The whole dual circulation
Mm-hmm.
theory, the notion that they want to reduce their dependence on the rest of the world, but increase the world's dependence on them. And these, it does help to actually
Read what they say.
read and listen, right? And as you know, my colleague Rash Doshi has launched an effort to
Right.
do mass translation of Chinese public documents, just so that people can see what it is they say, because that is how they communicate to their cadres of what their strategy is. And so President Xi has been prolific, and other leaders in China, and has laid out quite explicitly now for some time that this is their strategy, and we're now seeing the results of that. And they've had quite significant progress over the last 12 years or so in achieving those objectives.
So, just assuming best case scenario, there's some sort of accommodation over the next either a couple of weeks or at least an extension, so that things don't really go upside down in the U.S.-China relationship. Is this latest move, at least from the U.S. side and some of the allies, is it so escalatory and potentially painful to our economies that this only, even if there's a deal, it just will accelerate U.S.-China decoupling, not de-risking, as I think some folks like to say, to sort of avoid, because the Chinese hate the decoupling word, although they're smart. They understand de-risking is basically decoupling light, so to speak,
Selectively,
selectively.
selective
But
decoupling.
does this? And it was one of the questions I got, from one of the readers is, will this accelerate the decoupling of the two economies, no matter what happens in terms of whether or not there's an agreement, sort of a short-term agreement between the U.S. and China?
I think in terms of selective decoupling, yes, because I think, well, this has been on the agenda and everyone has been admiring the problem of critical minerals dependencies. This is yet another data point that we need to move ahead and find solutions. And so the Biden administration started working on this, and it brought together groups of countries to talk about cooperation on critical minerals. I expect the Trump administration to follow up on that and to do the same. And I think that will likely continue. And we'll be looking at other dependencies as well, dependencies on the active pharmaceutical ingredients that go into so many of our medicines, for example.
Mm-hmm.
That's another area where we are almost completely dependent on China for our drugs. And that's something we feel comfortable with. So I think it is likely to have a long-term impact as just another data point that the West has to get its act together there. I do think on the de-risking versus decoupling, and here I think we don't need to decouple completely from the Chinese economy. We shouldn't, and it would be even if we could. In many cases, we can't. Do we need to make our own T-shirts and sneakers in the United States? We do have, by the way, we have some wonderful companies in the U.S. that do make, some portion of their sneakers or some percentage of their sneakers in the U.S., and that's great. And we have a vibrant textile industry, particularly of advanced materials of textiles
Mm-hmm.
that is terrific. But do we need to impose higher costs on low-income Americans to buy, the very basics that they need for their family that are not strategic, that are coming in from China? And I think that's where the Biden administration reviewed the tariffs and never moved on them. The Trump administration, of course, has only increased the tariffs. I think it's part of some overall deal here, figuring
Mm-hmm.
out what's strategic and what's not strategic, and putting restrictions on or putting tariffs on where we really feel it's going to have an effect that we're looking for in terms of reducing our dependency on a strategic input, but being willing to allow the relationship, whether it's in agriculture or basic consumer products, where there may be less strategic importance to being independent of China, letting that kind of trade continue to grow.
Well, and on agriculture, clearly the U.S. soybean farmers are in a lot of pain because the Chinese are just not buying. But that's, I think, from the Chinese perspective, they back to diversification. They started this and Trump won, and that market, even if they buy some few ship cargoes of soybeans, that is never coming back for the Chinese for the U.S. farmers, right? The Chinese are diversified to Brazil, they diversified to Argentina, and so in some ways, it just seems like the Chinese are, as much as they criticize de-risking and decoupling, they've actually been much more proactive in many ways about that.
I think that's right. I mean, again, going back to dual circulation and the various other names they've had for their strategy, they have very much looked at this at decoupling. They were the original decouplers when it came to saying, when it comes to these
Right.
technologies, we're going to be dominant. We're not going to be dependent on the U.S. We're going to pursue our own. And we're going to make the rest of the world dependent on us. And so, they've had that strategy in place for some time. And look, it's a broader issue. I wrote about a year ago a piece on China about how we expected China and U.S. to converge in their economic models when we brought China into the global trading system. We expected China to become more like us, to be open.
Not necessarily a liberal democracy, but
No, but from an economic point of view,
right.
Jiang Zemin, Zhu Rongji, they laid out a rather aggressive strategy of restructuring the Chinese economy and using opening and using foreign investment and other measures to help drive their development. And what's happened instead, or in addition, is that we've become more like China. So having argued with that the Chinese should not engage in protectionism, restrict foreign investment, engage in industrial policy, or take stakes in private companies and get involved in private companies. We're now engaged in protectionism, restricting foreign investment, engaged in industrial policy, and taking stakes in private companies. So we have become more like them. And I think the question is, can we compete with them on their turf on according to their rules of the road? I tend to think it's harder for us to out industrial policy the PRC. They have infinitely greater resources and fewer political constraints on throwing money at a new technology or a new sector or a new problem. We can't even fund the government at the moment, and so I worry that we have now moved our competitive landscape to their rules of the road, which it does not play to our advantage.
And that goes back to sort of the ruins of the rules based system, because I mean it also is a broader question from history. Will history look back at the sort of the assumptions about trading with China as totally wrong, partially wrong, right thing at the right time, but not adjusted sort of in real time as China started to show that they weren't going to evolve the way sort of the baseline assumption was when they were brought more into the trading system?
So look, I think when we go back and try and get back in the time machine to the late '90s, when we were beginning to negotiate China's entry into the global trading system, based on the information we had at the time as
Mm-hmm.
to what their strategy was, it seemed like they were on this inexorable path towards greater liberalization, openness, market-based decisions. And they have gone down that road to a very significant extent, but not as far, not as fast, and in not as linear a manner
Right.
as I think we expected at the time. And I think what folks did not necessarily anticipate was a President Xi who came in and fundamentally changed direction. If not stopping liberalization,
Yeah.
certainly reasserting the party and pursuing a strategy that came very much at the expense of the rest of the world. So I think the challenge that we face. The other thing I would say is, we look at the so-called China shock, their entry into the WTO. I think the estimates are that we lost somewhere between 2 and 3 million jobs over a 12-year period in manufacturing in the United States because of China's integration into the global economy. That is a lot. It sounds like a lot, but just to put it in context, so that's something like 250,000 jobs a quarter or something of that, or no, that's so yeah, so more 250,000 jobs a year. We have 30 million people changing jobs every year. We have adding or subtracting 250,000 jobs every month in our jobs report. I think it was because it was so acute in specific industries and specific
Mm-hmm.
geographies, oftentimes in communities where that was the only factory
Right.
that was employing people, and it had a significant impact there. And I think one thing we need to look back on ourselves, and it's relevant to other challenges today, is that neither Democratic nor Republican Congresses, administrations uh, were able to do enough to take action to prepare American workers to survive and thrive in a rapidly changing economy. Most of those changes come from technology, by the way. 80%, it's estimated, 80% of job loss in the manufacturing came from automation, not from trade.
Not from.
Uh, but trade played a role, and we've never had a robust domestic agenda around place-based development, transition assistance, not the kind of trade adjustment assistance that sort of existed at the margins, but really thinking through how do we ensure that workers get the lifelong learning and training they need to take on new challenges with each generation of technology. And the reason I emphasize this, Bill, is if we lost 2 to 3 million jobs because of China over a 12-year period, the estimates of what could happen with AI over a much shorter period of time, losing tens of millions of jobs, we're no better place now than we were then to help our workers
Right.
manage through that. And if that had political ramifications in terms of greater populism and people feeling like the system wasn't working for them, that they were being left behind, which is totally understandable. Imagine what the political ramifications are of tens of millions of people over a shorter period of time feeling like they have no economic future.
I mean, as a parent, we have twin girls. They're in college, and they're sophomores in college, and you wonder what's the job market can be for them when they get out.
That's right.
Very very privileged kids who are at good schools and good majors, but it's so you just think about how many people are potentially going to be disrupted very quickly. And so this is great because I think you are a professional podcaster because you just set up the perfect segue to my next question, which is about your recent piece you wrote about sort of China and AI.
Hmm.
And sort of what you think about, I mean, this broader issue of AI, but then also specifically China and AI and sort of where they're going and what that means for them and for us.
Well, look, we're on this race to achieve artificial general intelligence
Right.
And pouring all of these resources, really an astounding amount of resource. Something like half of our GDP growth is due to the investment of the hyperscalers and
And
others
much of the stock market appreciation this year.
is tied to that because we think it's important to beat China in achieving that. And their estimates are we 3 months ahead, 9 months ahead, 18 months ahead. I don't think anybody really knows. Maybe it's by necessity because they don't have access to the advanced chips that we have, or maybe it's by choice. But China is going down a somewhat different route. They too are trying to achieve AGI as quickly as they can, but their focus seems to be more on how do we make sure that AI is implemented through our economy thoroughly. And so they actually have, they have measures, they have KPIs. They say it's 70% now, and they want 95% by 2030 and 100% by 2035
They just
of all the sectors.
released that AI plus action plan with their
Exactly.
targets.
Exactly. And so they may be behind us in achieving AGI, but they may be ahead of us in thinking through how is it going to revolutionize manufacturing? How's it going to
Mhm.
revolutionize transportation? And they may be better prepared to implement innovations, whether they come from China or come from the US, when the time comes. I'm not saying we shouldn't be trying to get to AGI as quickly as possible. I don't know how important that is or what happens during those 9 months that we have it and the Chinese don't necessarily. But I do think it is important that we think through how it's going to be applied and distributed, deployed, whether it's from our military perspective, our industrial perspective, or across the economy generally.
And that is that something the Council on Foreign Relations is working on?
Well, we are. I mean, we're particularly from the defense industrial base perspective, and we've got a good group of people here, Mike Horowitz, Rush Doshi, others who are going to dig into. So, what is this? What does the availability of emerging technology mean for the future of the defense space, and how do we achieve scale in our defense industrial production so that we have what we need to compete and to deter and to defeat potential threats.
Okay, so I want to be cognizant of your time. You've been very generous with it. I actually have one specific question, last question, and then sort of a broader to end on. But can you talk a little bit about what the council's approach to working with China and how um, there's lots of sort of who can you talk to on the Chinese side, and where do you find you have the most useful or valuable conversations when dealing with Chinese interlocutors?
So, I mean, we have, I think we have a decent relationship with Chinese scholars and with Chinese government officials. We've hosted Chinese government officials here. We often have delegations of Chinese former officials and academics
Mm-hmm.
come through New York or Washington and want to meet with our fellows. We have a great bench of China experts here. On trade, on military, on political issues, and of course China's role in the rest of the world. We have scholars covering all the rest of the world, and so very engaged also in following what they're doing in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and the like. So we do engage with them. We are a U.S. Focused think tank. You have to be a
Mm-hmm.
U.S. citizen to be a member of the council. Our focus is really on how to inform U.S. engagement with the world, and so we also very much work with the administration, whatever administration is in power, and we work with Congress to help support them in as they work through these difficult issues vis-a-vis China as well.
Great. And so the last question is, what should I have asked you, or what else would you like to tell the audience?
Look, I think you covered. I think you covered the landscape. You know, I think I think the biggest question really is, can the Trump administration use its quite considerable political capital to over the next few years to redefine the relationship with China, which is, in my view, still the most important relationship in the world for this going forward for the next several decades. And how do we get there? You know, and it can't just be by escalating conflict and de-escalating and escalating and de-escalating. We got to get to the core issues in the relationship, have a dialogue that can have an honest discussion around those, and then see how we can we live with each other that doesn't sacrifice U.S. interests, but also make sure that we can achieve what we need to achieve together.
And the hope being that those core interests are, the disagreements aren't so large that they're just impossible to bridge the gap.
Even right? During the days of the Cold War, we had lots of engagement with the Soviet Union. Now it's a very different kind of rivalry with China than it was with the Soviet Union. But there were areas of commonality that we were able to work on, whether it was arms control, which is an area that we have not yet really cracked with China, whether it was regional security, and of course today's issue of climate change, which wasn't top of mind back then, wasn't really relevant to the Soviet Union. But this is a global issue that we need to address as well, and we can't do it one or the other. We need to do it together.
Yeah. So, well, thank you so much, Ambassador Froman, for your time. This has been a really great discussion. I will, everyone, thanks for joining. This will go out as a recording later today, and I will have in the show notes links to your recent articles as well as your Substack. And I encourage everyone to subscribe to Ambassador Froman's Substack. It's great. You're writing weekly, is that right? You sort of do a weekly column. Is that the cadence?
I do on Fridays.
That's great. And I think your predecessor, Richard Haas, does one too.
Absolutely.
He's on there. So it's good. It's great. As I said, I've been on Substack. Today's my 8th anniversary of launching on Substack.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's great to see so many much smarter, more accomplished people joining and really building up a good community. So again, Ambassador Froman, thank you so much for your time, and thanks everyone for joining. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.